Hello and welcome to my chapter-by-chapter summary and context. Travels in the central parts of Indochina, Siam, Cambodia, and Laos during the years 1858, 1859, and 1860 by Henri Mouhot. The memoir of Monsieur Henri Mouhot was written by J.J. Belinfante from The Hague in December 1862. Nowadays, memoir is synonymous with autobiography, but it's always been more widely defined as inclusive of biography, but specific to an important career event or time, and that's what this is. Belinfante was a publisher, journalist, and historian from one of the most illustrious Jewish families in the Netherlands. The Belinfantes traced their family tree back over several centuries and emigrations from Turkey through Portugal and Italy before finally arriving in the Netherlands in the early 1600s. They established the first ever Dutch news agency, expanded into popular and specialist publishing, and had more or less the monopoly on Dutch journalism for over 200 years, remaining strong competitors not only after the advent of state media, but even after the Holocaust, with their original bookshop only closing in 1985. Belinfante became a very close friend of Mouhot as the Dutch printer/publisher and occasional contributor to, excuse my French pronunciation, La Revue du Monde, full title Journal des voyages, de l'administration et des mœurs, etc., chez les différents peuples du globe, archives géographiques et historiques du XIXe siècle, rédigé par une société de savants, de voyageurs et de littérature français et étranger. English translation: The Review of Two Worlds, Journal of Travels, Administration, and Mores, etc., among different peoples of the world, or Geographical and Historical Archive of the 19th century, composed by a society of French and foreign savants, explorers, and authors. And another publication, Moniteur des Indes orientales et occidentales, or the East and West Indies Monitor. When the Mouhot brothers traveled to Holland to make daguerreotypes, they were extensively introduced and entertained by the Belinfantes. Belinfante says Henri Mouhot was born in Montbéliard on the Swiss border on May 15, 1826, making him just 35 at the time of his death. For reference, Montbéliard was annexed by France in 1793 from the then Duchy of Württemberg during a time of unrest in both countries. The exchange was confirmed in 1806, post-French Revolution, and during the German Mediatisierung. Belinfante describes the Mouhot family as, quote, not rich but respectable, unquote, valuing education above all else. Mouhot's father is described as having spent his entire salary as a low-level administrator in the government of Louis Philippe and subsequently the Second Republic on the education of his sons, and Mouhot's mother as, quote, a teacher of considerable merit, whose memory is held in respect by all who knew her, unquote, who died early from overwork, fatigue, and heartbreak in providing same. Belinfante states that Henri Mouhot was originally educated as a philologist, but switched to the study of quote-unquote natural sciences thanks to inspiration from fellow sons of Montbéliard, Cuvier and Laurière. Georges Cuvier is widely regarded as the founding father of paleontology. He made foundational contributions to the fields of comparative anatomy and paleontology by systematically comparing living animals with fossils and establishing extinction as a scientific fact at a time when it was considered controversial speculation. His work laid the groundwork for vertebrate paleontology and expanded Linnaean taxonomy by grouping classes into phyla and incorporating both fossil and living species into a unified classification system. The previously mentioned Castelnau was one of Baron Cuvier's students. Charles Laurière, the secretary of Cuvier at the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle, or Natural History Museum in Paris, for just under 30 years, wrote several works of comparative anatomy and described a number of genera and species himself. Belinfante describes Mouhot's facility in the Russian and Polish languages gained during his career as an English and French tutor and then certified professor living in Russia from 1844 to around 1854 as coming easily to him thanks to his mastery of both French and Greek. Funny? He didn't mention English, which for Mouhot was obviously a fluent second or third language. Belinfante further states that Mouhot's travel bug first revealed itself in Russia, where he traveled much of the empire, quote, from St. Petersburg to Sebastopol and from Warsaw to Moscow, unquote. So how did Mouhot make his living traveling the Russian Empire? In addition to tutoring French and English, he mastered daguerreotype making and made a comfortable living from photographing people in places where photography had not previously been available. Between the foreign language tutoring and the portrait making services, Mouhot achieved considerable social and professional status in Russia via this sort of backdoor introduction to high society. Belinfante writes that Mouhot was, quote, admitted into several establishments, both public and private, among them the cadets of Voronezh. He adds that though a Frenchman, Mouhot was well connected enough to have remained in Russia safely for the duration of the Crimean War, but chose to leave when things really started heating up. Belinfante describes Mouhot as the typical Renaissance man of the Victorian era, pursuing advanced academics in his off hours. Quote, devoting himself in his hours of leisure and at night to the cultivation of the arts and sciences, and profiting by his visits to various towns and departments of the empire, he constantly augmented his collection of drawings and photographs comprising landscapes illustrating different parts of the country, portraits of distinguished men, specimens from museums, and buildings in the semi-Byzantine style, equally interesting to artists and to archaeologists, unquote. He also mentions Mouhot's unpublished novel, provisionally titled Slavery in Russia, to explain that while Mouhot was generally apolitical, he was totally against slavery and serfdom wherever he found it, and he found too much of it and too much suffering due to it in Russia. Belinfante describes how, upon returning to France, Mouhot did not stay there, but rather taught his brother Charles photography, and thence they traveled together through Germany, Belgium, northern Italy, and Holland, selling photographs from 1854 to 1856. They finally settled with their wives in Jersey in 1856, with Henri studying ornithology and conchology, in other words, birds and shells, dividing his time equally between, quote, his home, his books, and outdoor pursuits, unquote. Belinfante describes Mouhot's wanderlust and specific interest in Southeast Asia as being inspired by, quote, an English book on Siam, unquote, widely assumed to be The Kingdom and People of Siam, a 2-volume study published in 1857 by Sir John Bowring, a British political economist and diplomat who was sent on a mission to Siam in 1855 to negotiate a treaty with the Siamese government. This work provides a detailed account of Siam's geography, history, culture, religion, and political structure, offering valuable insight into the diplomatic and social landscape of mid-19th century Siam. Quote, as though sent by the hand of destiny to visit that country, became the object of his aspirations, unquote. Belinfante adds that Mouhot wished, quote, to visit, in the cause of science, regions little known but where, through much fatigue and danger, the prospect of a glorious future opened itself before him. He describes Mouhot's death as somewhat predictable, despite his previously excellent health and fitness, in his opinion due to the sheer amount of time spent in Southeast Asia. Quote, he was already well prepared for the life, active, strong, and blessed with an excellent constitution. His physical strength was beyond the average, a result of the gymnastic sports in which he had taken pleasure in his youth, and of his habitual sobriety. He had never had an attack of fever nor any other illness, and he resisted for 4 years the effects of a tropical climate, incredible fatigue, bad food, and nights passed in forests, without any apparent loss of health or strength, which is doubtless to be attributed to his never taking spirits and wine only very sparingly, unquote. Mouhot's death is attributed in the end to, quote, jungle fever after 22 days illness, unquote. Further along, Belinfante notes that in their account of his death, the Illustrated London News counted Mouhot as, quote, another addition to the long list of martyrs to science, unquote. Martyrs to science, what a powerful phrase and concept. Today, the notion that Southeast Asia was a white man's grave seems silly, but only because we benefit from decades of epidemic disease eradication efforts and vaccination regimes prior to our births. Back then, tropical medicine didn't exist, and mosquito-borne illnesses, other parasitic illnesses, and infections due to a total lack of hygiene were endemic. Where locals had some exposure immunity, Europeans had none, and mortality rates were truly extremely high. In addition to physical fitness, Belinfante describes Mouhot as having the appropriate personality and skills to succeed as an explorer. Quote, his intellectual and moral qualities did not seem less to promise success. Both a savant and an artist, he was also an indefatigable hunter, and had a degree of kindness mingled with his courage, which was sure to gain the goodwill of the uncivilized people among whom he had to live. In all these respects, Monsieur Mouhot fulfilled the expectations of the savants of England and of his numerous friends, unquote. Further, quote, the loss, by the wreck of the Sir James Brooke, of a very valuable collection, did not discourage him, but he set about at once to replace it, unquote. He further quotes Schomburg to remind you, the British consul in Siam, quote, I admired the zeal and knowledge of your late brother, and his manners were so amiable and modest that one would have thought that everyone with whom he came in contact would have exercised all their influence to assist him in his plans, unquote. Belinfante, I think, successfully paints Mouhot as a blameless Icarus here. He mentions the uncertainty as to where exactly Mouhot died. Quote, he set out for Luang Prabang on 15th October and on the 18th halted at H. The name is unfinished in the manuscript, unquote. Today we know Mouhot died near a village called Napan. Perhaps the N was mistaken for H when they were reading the journal. Belinfante emphasizes throughout by describing Mouhot's collections and notes and naming esteemed scientists who cited and discussed them in their published papers. Mouhot's achievements as a, quote, zoological collector and explorer, unquote. Today, Mouhot is thought of almost exclusively as the European discoverer, if you will, of Angkor Wat, but his goal in exploring Southeast Asia was the collection and description of novel specimens. And the several named after him attest to that sustained and focused effort. A previously unknown turtle, snake, beetle, spider, stickbug, and snail are all Mouhotii. Finally, throughout, Belinfante cites various eulogiums, admiring or praising various of Mouhot's traits, from scientific accomplishments to religious faith to gentleness and generosity. The most powerful paragraph in the memoir is, in my opinion, one in which Belinfante quotes a letter he received from a missionary whom had met Mouhot in Siam and Cambodia and wrote, quote, I learned when on my mission the death of my father and then that of my mother. I assure you that these two cruel blows scarcely made more impression on me than the news of the death of a man whose equal I had not met with during the 20 years that I have inhabited that country. And to hear of his dying without any help, and having no one near him but his servants throughout his illness, in a country so barbarous, was more than sufficient to make tears flow at the memory of this good and benevolent friend. Be assured, my dear sir, that my sentiments are shared by all here who knew Monsieur Mouhot. The natives themselves must have felt regret at his loss, for all whom he came near praised him for his behavior towards them, and his gentleness and generosity, qualities invaluable in the eyes of that people, unquote. Finally, I'd like to discuss the use of the words uncivilized and barbarous thus far. I was genuinely surprised when perusing reviews on Goodreads at the number of people calling this book racist, casually racist, or benevolently racist, citing the use of such words. To be clear, I think there are some debatable examples of such in the book that will be broached in their own chapters. While Mouhot doesn't make many sweeping judgments of entire races, if you will, he does make some. However, the use of these words, specifically uncivilized and barbarous, in my opinion, doesn't clear the bar for racism. Uncivilized and barbarous are synonyms, the first derived from Latin, the second Greek. Uncivilized literally translates to not a townsman or citizen, in other words, not proper Romans, not raised with the norms, manners, or education required to function in the public life of the metropole. So country or low class, they're alien to the ruling classes, whether or not they're foreign. Barbarous in Greek means foreign, strange, or ignorant, and derives from the Proto-Indo-European root barbar, an onomatopoeic word conveying the echoic quality of unintelligible foreign speech. To the Greeks, and then the Romans, and then their European descendants, barbaroi were all tribes or nations who didn't have Greek or Roman accomplishments, not because they were incapable of them, but because they didn't share Greek or Roman values and therefore didn't aspire to achieving them. The word describes not just a language barrier, but a cultural obstacle, and that's why what barbaroi thought or said didn't matter much to the Greeks and Romans. Bar, blah, blah, blah. These are non-racial terms describing in-group, out-group, cultural, and class dynamics. It's a chicken-egg question: which came first, hierarchies or in and out groups? It's also interesting to note that barbarous didn't connote unduly cruel until the 1580s, and uncivilized didn't connote ill-mannered until the 1590s. Rather later than I would have guessed, and doubtless a product of late Renaissance humanism and the lens it provided for reinterpreting rediscovered Greek philosophical works. On one hand, virtue signaling and hyperbole are nothing new. On the other, most present-day ties would call slavery and total ignorance of hygiene uncivilized and barbarous just as readily as Mouhot then did. So were they condescending terms in 1862? Undoubtedly. Are they inaccurate assessments of Mouhot's surroundings and resources during most of his travels? No, with few exceptions. He traveled and died among people not of his culture or class, with whom his communication was limited, who didn't share his education, interests, or values, living in conditions well beneath what he was accustomed to. To him, many of the people he observed may have been uncivilized barbarians, and to many of them, he doubtless seemed a crazy farang. But as far as the people he interacted with and dealt with regularly, none of the involved individuals discussed seemed to much value those distinctions. I didn't get the impression Mouhot or his guides intentionally disrespected one another much, if at all. That would certainly not have worked on their mission.